The hook and story below are written purely as requested. No files needed, just pure narrative output. She watched through the kitchen blinds as the woman climbed her fence for the fourth time that week. She had tried asking nicely. She had tried a lock, now she was done trying. The morning Petra Calloway decided she was finished being polite, the air smelled like chlorine and something about to break. She had lived on Sycamore Crescent for 11 years. She had planted the hedges herself, hauled the soil in her own truck, laid the pavers around the pool one stone at a time over a summer so brutal that she'd cried twice from the heat and kept going anyway. The pool had been her late husband Marcus's idea, not the luxury kind with infinity edges and recessed lighting, but a clean, functional rectangle of blue water that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything feel, briefly, manageable. After Marcus died 3 years ago from a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was making coffee, the pool became the one thing that kept Petra tethered to the house, to the property, to the version of herself that had built something real. Her neighbor, Darlene Moswick, had moved in 14 months ago. Petra remembered the day clearly. A moving truck, a team of hired movers, and Darlene herself standing in the driveway in pristine white sneakers, directing traffic with the energy of someone who had never been told no and did not believe such a word applied to her. She was in her mid-50s, taller than Petra by several inches, with sharp cheekbones and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from achievement but from an unexamined assumption of superiority. She wore expensive athleisure before noon and regular clothes never. She drove a white SUV she kept polished to a mirror finish. She had a daughter named Brinley who visited on weekends and sat by Darlene's kitchen window, staring at Petra's pool with thinly concealed longing. The first trespass had happened 6 months after Darlene moved in. Petra had been at the grocery store. She came home to find Brinley, 17 at the time, in a bikini, floating on an inflatable ring in Petra's pool. Darlene was seated in one of Petra's own lounge chairs, sunglasses on, a glass of lemonade on the side table. Petra had stood at the gate, bags in both hands, and simply stared. Darlene had looked up and smiled. "Hope you don't mind. Brinley's been so stressed about her exams and the sun was just perfect today." Petra had minded. She had said so, calmly and clearly. She had asked them to leave. Darlene had gathered herself with theatrical inconvenience, as though the violation were Petra's for pointing it out, and they had left without apology. Petra installed a padlock on the gate the following week. 2 weeks later, she found the padlock on the ground, cut through with bolt cutters. Brinley was in the pool again. Darlene was not present this time, but a towel with the initials DM was folded on the chair. Petra had called the non-emergency police line. An officer named Constable Renfrew had come, spoken to Darlene over the fence with the weary diplomacy of a man who had seen this kind of dispute 100 times and left without issuing anything more than a verbal warning. Darlene had listened to the officer with an expression of patient tolerance, as though she were entertaining a mildly tedious conversation at a dinner party. "We were just using it," she told Constable Renfrew. "It's not as though she was home." "The ownership of the property doesn't become conditional on occupancy," the officer said, with more precision than Petra had expected. Darlene had smiled and said nothing. Petra had installed a new, heavier padlock, a combination lock this time, with a shrouded shackle designed to resist bolt cutters. She had also installed a camera, a small, weatherproof device mounted on the corner of her fence, angled toward the gate. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Then Darlene's brother-in-law, a squat man named Terrence, who visited occasionally and whose primary personality trait appeared to be the willingness to do whatever Darlene asked, had simply climbed the fence. He had disabled the camera, or attempted to, by pulling it off its mount. What he did not know was that it had already uploaded its footage to the cloud continuously. Petra had watched the recording that evening on her laptop. Terrence climbing the fence with the precise, shameless confidence of a man who had been told there would be no consequences. Petra had gone to the station in person that time, not the non-emergency line, the station. She had asked for a formal report. She had printed the camera footage. She had sat across from a sergeant named Briggs and laid everything out in the organized, unambiguous way that a woman who spent 30 years as a civil engineer and never raised her voice in a meeting has learned to present information. Sergeant Briggs had taken the report seriously. He had issued Darlene a formal written warning. Trespassing charges could follow any future incident, he told Petra. The property had been clearly posted. The previous verbal warning was on record. The footage established willful, repeated entry. Petra had come home feeling for the first time that the machinery of consequence was finally engaged. She had replaced the camera with 2 cameras. She had installed a second padlock. She had posted a printed notice on the gate. Private property. No trespassing. Violations subject to criminal prosecution. Surveillance in use. Darlene had seen the notice. Petra knew this because she had been watching from the kitchen window when Darlene walked past the gate on her morning walk, paused, read the sign with pursed lips, and continued on without changing her expression. 4 days later, Petra came home from her Thursday afternoon shift volunteering at the community library to find the gate open. Not forced. Open. Someone had figured out the combination. She suspected Terrence, who had once worked as a locksmith, or had simply waited and watched her enter it. Brinley was not in the pool this time, but someone had been. There was a wet towel, Darlene's monogram again, draped over the fence rail. There was a half-finished bottle of sunscreen on the side table. There was a damp impression on one of the lounge chairs. They had been there and left before she returned. Left proof anyway, deliberately, as though they wanted her to know. Petra stood at the edge of her pool in the late afternoon quiet and felt something shift inside her. Not rage, exactly. Not sadness. Something colder and more final than either of those. The feeling of a person who has extended every reasonable form of goodwill and watched it be absorbed and discarded by someone who experiences decency as weakness. She went inside and made dinner. She ate it slowly. She thought about Marcus, who had been a patient man, a builder of things, someone who believed that most conflicts resolved themselves if you held firm and kept your hands clean. She thought about what he would have said. She thought about it for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and started searching. She was not looking for revenge in the theatrical sense. She was looking for something legal, something proportionate, something that would make the pool genuinely, thoroughly, spectacularly unusable in a way that no amount of Darlene's entitlement could overcome. Something that would not damage the pool itself or contaminate the water in any lasting way. Something that would simply stop it for long enough to make a point that couldn't be ignored or reframed. She found what she was looking for on a specialty aquatic products forum, of all places, in a thread about competitive swim meets and temporary pool modifications. A user named Aquatic Specialist 74 had described a product used by event coordinators to mark lane boundaries and differentiate pool sections for charity swims and athletic exhibitions. The product was a hydrogel compound, non-toxic, biodegradable, and specifically designed to be added to water in large quantities. When mixed in sufficient concentration, it transformed the water into a thick, deeply pigmented gel, blue being the most common color, that was completely harmless, but deeply, aggressively unpleasant to enter. It clung to skin and clothing. It took multiple showers to remove fully. It was not dangerous, not irritating, not chemically active in any way that would affect pool equipment or damage surfaces. But it was extraordinarily persistent on the body. The dye component, also non-toxic, stained skin the blue of a bruise for approximately 72 hours, 48 to 72 hours, 3 days. The gel itself dissolved in the pool within 4 to 5 days through normal filtration, leaving no permanent alteration to the water chemistry. The pool needed a full filter run and a chemical balance check, which Petra did routinely anyway. She had ordered 16 kilograms of the product on a Friday and paid for expedited shipping. It had arrived on Monday. She had spent that Monday evening reading the product documentation with the thoroughness of a woman who had once certified 200 kilometers of infrastructure reports and had never cut corners on anything she built or did. The compound was legal to possess and use. It was classified as a novelty aquatic additive. It was sold commercially for events. It was non-toxic to humans and animals per the safety sheet. It required dilution at a specific ratio to achieve the desired gel consistency, and she had calculated the ratio for her pool's volume precisely. She had waited until Tuesday evening, when the light was failing and the air was still, and she had dissolved the compound in the pool methodically, moving around the edge with a long-handled stirrer and watching the water change. It did not change immediately. It took about 40 minutes. But by the time she was done, the pool that had once been a clean rectangle of blue water was something else entirely. A still, deeply saturated gel, color of a midnight ocean, surface barely reflecting the last of the daylight. It looked extraordinary, she thought. It looked like something from a nature documentary about bioluminescent bays, except still. Absolutely still. She had stood at the edge and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went inside, made tea, and waited. She did not have to wait long. Wednesday morning, 6:43. She was at the kitchen table with her tea when the motion alert pinged on her phone. She watched the feed on the small screen. Darlene, in her morning walk clothes, had stopped at the gate. She was looking at the pool. Even on the small screen, Petra could see the moment of confusion. The slight tilt of the head, the pause that lasted a beat too long. The pool looked different. Still, strangely beautiful perhaps. Darlene tried the gate. The padlock held. Petra had relocked it the previous night. Darlene stood for another moment, then continued on. Petra knew, with the certainty of someone who had observed this particular behavior pattern for 14 months, that Darlene would be back. She was back at 11:47. She had Terrence with her. Petra watched the feed in real time. Terrence examined the padlock briefly, then simply climbed the fence as he had before, over the top rail, dropping down on the other side with practiced ease. He went to the gate and opened it from the inside. Darlene walked through. Brinley was not with them. It was just the two of them, and they were carrying towels. Petra set her phone down on the table. She picked up her tea. She waited. 3 minutes and 40 seconds passed before the first sound came through the open kitchen window. A short, sharp exclamation from Darlene, high-pitched and genuine, followed immediately by Terrence saying something Petra couldn't fully make out, his voice rising with the particular upward inflection of sudden shock. Petra rose from her chair, walked to the back door, and opened it. What she saw would have been funny if it had not been so completely, thoroughly earned. Darlene had entered the pool. She had entered it at the steps, which meant she had walked down into it with the confidence of someone who had done this a dozen times and expected the same cool, yielding water. Instead, she had met the gel. She was in up to her waist, and she was standing perfectly still with her arms held out to her sides like a person who has reached out in a dark room and found walls where they expected open space. The gel had stained her lower half with deep, vivid blue, her white shorts, which were already ruined, and her legs, which were not. She was staring down at herself with an expression that Petra would later describe, to exactly one person, as the face of someone finally understanding that the world contained consequences. Terrence had not entered the pool. He was standing on the deck, one foot extended, having touched the surface of the gel with a sandaled foot before thinking better of full entry. The sandal was blue, his toes were blue. He was staring at Darlene. Petra walked to the fence that separated their yards and stood there with her arms folded, and said nothing. Darlene turned and looked at her. The silence lasted a very long time. "What?" Darlene finally said with great difficulty, "is in your pool?" "A legal aquatic additive," Petra said. "Non-toxic, biodegradable. The safety documentation is available upon request." "This is..." Darlene looked down at herself again. Her legs were electric blue to the knee. Her shorts were entirely ruined. She had touched the rail coming down the steps, and one hand was stained to the wrist. "This is going to come off." "With several showers," Petra said. "Over approximately 3 days." Terrence said with quiet devastation. 3 days. "The product literature suggests 72 hours, Petra said, though individual variation applies." Darlene began to move toward the steps, and the gel moved with her, thick and slow and deeply, brilliantly blue, parting like heavy water but clinging to everything it touched. She reached the steps and climbed out with the dignity of a person who has lost all dignity and is choosing to pretend otherwise. She stood on the deck dripping gel, which was not actually dripping. It clung, not dripping, held to her by its own viscosity. "You did this on purpose," Darlene said. "I maintain my pool as I choose," Petra said, "as is my right, on my property." "My clothes were worn onto property you entered illegally," Petra said, "despite a formal police warning, despite 2 padlocks, despite posted signage, and despite being asked repeatedly to stop over a period of 14 months. The word illegally landed between them with the weight of something that couldn't be taken back. Terrence looked at Darlene. Darlene looked at Terrence. Something passed between them that was not quite communication, more a simultaneous recognition of a situation that had, somewhere in the last 14 months, quietly, entirely, gotten away from them. Darlene pulled her towel around herself with what remained of her composure and walked through the gate, which Terrence held open, his blue-toed sandal leaving blue prints on the pavement, without saying another word. Petra stood at the fence and watched them cross the driveway and enter Darlene's house. She stood there for a moment longer in the quiet that followed. Then she went inside, washed her hands, and called Sergeant Briggs to let him know she had camera footage of a 4th trespass on her property and would be filing a formal complaint in the morning. Sergeant Briggs said he would have someone reach out by end of business. Petra made a second cup of tea, carried it to the back deck, and sat in the afternoon light looking at her pool. That extraordinary, vivid, deep blue gel, perfectly still in the afternoon sun, not a mark on its surface, not a ripple, as though the events of the morning had never touched it. It was, she thought, the most beautiful the pool had ever looked. She sat there until the sun moved behind the roofline, and then she went inside and started making dinner. She had not smiled during any of it. She was not gloating. She was not triumphant in the way people are triumphant when they have beaten someone. She was something quieter and more solid than that. She was a woman who had built something real, defended it by every legitimate means available, and finally, on the fourth attempt, had found a form of consequence that could not be climbed over, cut through, or explained away. The pool was still her pool. The fence was still her fence. And for the first time in 14 months, both of those facts felt permanently true. The blue did not come off Darlene Moswick in one shower. She had stood under the water for 40 minutes the first time, scrubbing with a loofah, and then with a cloth, and then with her hands, watching the blue swirl down the drain in long rivulets, and then slow and then stop. Not because it was gone, but because what remained was bonded to the upper layer of her skin in a way that hot water and friction could not immediately undo. She had looked at her legs in the bathroom mirror when she stepped out. They were lighter than they had been, but they were still deeply, unmistakably blue from the knee down, with a gradient fade toward her thighs, and her right hand and wrist were stained in a wide smear that did not care about soap. Terrence had showered in the guest bathroom and emerged 20 minutes later, still wearing blue toes. He had stood in Darlene's kitchen in silence for a moment, looking at his feet, and then said he needed to get home. Darlene had not stopped him. She had stood in her kitchen in her bathrobe, wet hair, blue legs, and looked out the window at Petra Calloway's backyard. The pool was visible through the gap in the hedges. It was still that extraordinary, unreal blue, perfectly still, surface untouched. It looked, and this was the thing that made something tighten unpleasantly in Darlene's chest, intentional, curated, like something Petra had done with complete calm and complete knowledge of what she was doing. Darlene had expected many possible responses from the woman next door over the past 14 months. She had expected escalating anger, perhaps, the kind of reactive emotional response that Darlene had learned early in life to handle by staying calmer, by speaking more slowly, by making the angry person look like the problem. She had expected more police calls, more notices, more of the paper trail posturing that she had assessed from the beginning as the action of someone who did not have the real leverage to actually stop anything. What she had not expected was this quiet, legal, perfectly timed, camera-documented, completely unanswerable thing. She couldn't claim the pool was safe to enter. It was her own legs proving that it was not. She couldn't claim she hadn't trespassed. The camera had her entry on file. She couldn't claim the product was illegal or harmful. It was clearly neither. She couldn't claim Petra had done anything wrong. She had maintained her own pool as she chose. The clarity of the trap she had walked into, or waded into, specifically, came to Darlene slowly, the way bad realizations often do, arriving not as a single blow, but as a series of smaller understandings that accumulated over the next several hours into something unavoidable. She had been warned, formally, on record. She had ignored it. She had sent Terrence back anyway. She had walked through the gate he opened. She had gone down those steps herself, with confidence, because she had done it before, and nothing had ever actually stopped her. And now there was footage of her standing waist-deep in blue gel on property she had illegally entered, and her legs were blue, and they were going to be blue for 3 days. Her daughter called that evening from the city. Brinley was 20, in her second year of university, and she had inherited Darlene's confidence without having yet acquired the careful self-editing that Darlene applied in public. She asked about the pool. She had heard somehow, through the informal network of neighborhood gossip that moved faster than Darlene had ever appreciated. And when Darlene described it, Brinley laughed. Not cruelly, not with contempt, just genuinely, reflexively, because the image was genuinely funny to a 20-year-old who did not have to live next door to the woman who had done it. "Mom," Brinley said, after she recovered, "why didn't you just ask her if we could use it?" Darlene had paused. "I did ask." "When?" Darlene thought about this. "Early on." "And she said no?" I don't think she was home." There was a silence on the line. "So you used it without asking," Brinley said. Not as an accusation, simply as a clarification, the way young people will sometimes do when they are organizing the facts of a story they have heard their entire lives from one angle. "It's a pool," Darlene said. "It sits there empty half the time." "It's her pool," Brinley said, with the plainness of someone stating a thing that should not need stating. Darlene had ended the call not long after. She had slept badly. She woke the next morning and showered again, with a different soap she had ordered on her phone at midnight based on a forum recommendation, and the blue faded a little more. She was moving from deep midnight to something closer to a bruised periwinkle, which was marginally better but still conspicuous. She had a lunch scheduled with her friend Margot, which she canceled. She had a hair appointment in the afternoon, which she also canceled because she did not want to sit in a salon chair explaining her legs to a stylist. She spent the morning in the house, and that was when she made the decision that she recognized, even as she made it, as a mistake, and made it anyway, because the alternative was sitting with the particular discomfort of being wrong in a way she could neither undo nor publicly acknowledge. She called the non-emergency police line and reported that her neighbor had put a dangerous substance in her pool and that she had been injured. The officer who came was not Constable Renfrew. It was a woman, Officer Calloway, not related to Petra, different name entirely, who arrived in a patrol car, knocked on Darlene's door, and stood in the entryway taking notes with the polite neutrality of someone who had been doing this job long enough to not have strong feelings about neighbor disputes in the early stages. Darlene described the situation. She showed Officer Calloway her legs, still blue, undeniably blue, though fading from the morning shower into something closer to denim. She described the burning sensation, which was mild and which she expanded upon. She described her ruined shorts, which she held up as evidence. She described Petra Calloway as aggressive, deliberately harmful, and in possession of a chemical substance she had used as a weapon against a neighbor. Officer Calloway listened to all of this. Then she asked several questions. Was Darlene injured beyond the skin discoloration? No, not exactly, but had Darlene sought medical attention? No, she hadn't thought. Had Darlene been on her own property when